just ended. The other one just ended. I came right through it. So just to give them a little bit of a chance to come in. Hi, Annette.
Hi, Julie.
Thank you for being here today.
So excited. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to get started. I know people will be coming in as we speak. My name is Lisa Deck. I am a board member for Rare New England, and it is my honor today to be here to introduce everybody to Annette Hines. Annette is the founding partner of Special Needs Law Group of Massachusetts and has been practicing in the area of special needs, elder law, and estate planning for over 20 years. Her clients include individuals and families of children with special needs, the elderly, and others in the community. She brings her personal experience with special needs to her practice as the mother of 2 daughters, one of whom passed away from mitochondrial disease in November 2013. This deep personal understanding of special needs fuels her passion for quality special needs planning and drives her dedication to the practice. And there is a lot more to be said about Annette, but she said keep it short because she wants to dive right in and give all of you lots of content. So I am honored to introduce all of you to Annette Hines. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, because I am so glad to be here today, and how meaningful to join you during this year of the 30th anniversary of the ADA. So, as you said, I'm an attorney, I'm an advocate, a business owner, but most importantly, a mom to 2 beautiful daughters, Elizabeth and Caroline. And my youngest daughter, Caroline, is 19 now and fabulous. I don't talk about her too much, frankly, because she doesn't like it when I do. But I will tell you a little bit about her later in this talk. It's my daughter, Elizabeth, that really brings me to be here with you today. Elizabeth was born a 29-week, 2-pound preemie, and she was the love of my life. I know it's really weird to say that, but I say was because 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago now, we lost Elizabeth to her disease. She was diagnosed at 2.5 with mito, FAOD, and a host of other issues as well. And it's strange to say that your child was the love of your life, but truly she was, even though she was profoundly intellectually disabled, blind, wheelchair bound, and nonverbal. But Elizabeth's smile lit up the world, and she and I had a bond that went beyond words. And truly I am honored to be here today speaking with you about what comes next. So these past 7 months have been very difficult on all of us, but perhaps have hit none harder than the disability and rare disease community. However, this pandemic has given us a unique opportunity to look at our educational system, healthcare system, and adult service system for all children and adults with fresh eyes, but particularly for our children with special needs. Together, we have learned so much. Let's put all our preconceived notions aside about education, wipe the slate clean, and start fresh. Let's look at our adult services system as well while we're at it. So I'm not an expert on education or a clinician, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. But what I am is a coalition builder. And I'm hoping to inspire you a little bit today to join me. Today, I'm going to talk to you about choice and voice. First, let me tell you about my first experience with making choices. When Elizabeth was quite young, she was already a very sick little girl. She required around-the-clock nursing care at many times in her life. Her disease was degenerative, so it was never getting better. And it was always a struggle to get her nursing hours filled. Staffing shortages in home care are such a problem for families everywhere then and now. Some of you may know exactly what I'm talking about. This makes families desperate, and we were constantly being told by the nursing agencies that would send nurses out to us that essentially this is all they had. So if I complained about somebody being late constantly or calling out sick or their lack of training, the agency would always warn me, okay, but you know that I have no one to replace him or her. It was essentially blackmail to just take what we could get. So you can picture that this would mean that occasionally we would have someone completely inappropriate in our home. Remember, I told you that Elizabeth was nonverbal. She had an intellectual disability, but that didn't mean that she couldn't communicate with me. One nurse came out and would start talking to her like she was a baby, when she was not a baby. Another would be very disrespectful to her. And I had another nurse who was extremely rough with her as she was getting her in and out of her equipment. Elizabeth would twist her body and turn away from these people when they were talking to her. She would cry. And although she had no ability to move away from them or get away from them, she was sending me clues as to her choice. Other caregivers she would connect with vocally and even with eye gazes, although she was blind with cortical visual impairment. She was clearly telling me her preferences for people who were taking good care of her and who were respectful to her. She was using her voice. It did take me a little bit to catch on to this, but it was one of my first experiences as an advocate for Elizabeth. As I would discuss this as Elizabeth's choice with the agency, I would get warned about the lack of available replacements, etc. I didn't care. I wanted Elizabeth to know that her voice and her choice mattered. I didn't understand it this way at the time, but it was her human right to have some control over who cared for her body in that way. Okay, now let's do a quick review of a few things happening around the country. By late March, all schools around the country were closed, and children had been moved to some form of online schooling or distance learning. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Families were forced to choose whether they wanted to bring their residential students and adults with disabilities home for the duration of the pandemic, however long that may be, or not be able to see them and spend time with them. Parents predominantly, I believe most polls had this well over 90% women, were struggling with managing education and care of the children, working from home or at an essential job, and care of other family members as well. It's quite a burden. The epidemic raged on, starting in the Northeast and then sweeping through the country. By June, it began to be crushing, and folks questioned what the next steps would be to reopen the country. Many school districts struggled to deliver educational services to special needs children, particularly the most challenged children. Children with low incidence or multiple disabilities, children with complex behavioral plans, and complex health situations. Yet we also heard from families that some children were thriving at home too. School districts were asking families around the country, for example, New Jersey, Illinois, to sign away their due process rights or allow them to suspend certain services under their IEPs that could not be delivered virtually. For example, here in Massachusetts, more than 12 school districts had presented waivers to families to sign that allowed the district to violate federal IDEA timelines for team meetings, evaluations, and implementing the education plan known as the IEP. Upon hearing this in May, the Federal Department of Education clarified for the states that no school districts should be asking families to sign such waivers of rights. Even still, many families throughout these months have seen de facto violations of their children's IEPs because delivering the services on those IEPs via online services is a near impossibility. As such, many families are considering lawsuits or have started lawsuits against their school districts for denial of FAPE. That's a free and appropriate education for their children. This is the guarantee that our federal government has made to us, and frankly, what our tax dollars have paid for. Class action lawsuits are being discussed and sought. One has been filed in New York City that is claiming plaintiffs in 20 states and growing. At the same time, school districts have approached their state and federal government to request relief from liability for lawsuits related to the virus on all sorts of levels, from children and adults contracting it on their premises to failure to deliver services properly under IEPs and so on. Now, these waivers vary state by state, and as of right now, school districts have not been issued any waivers from the federal government under IDEA yet. However, teachers all over the country were scared to return to work. A lawsuit was filed in Florida against Governor DeSantis, arguing that there is no safe way to open schools. Teachers' unions representing their members in other large cities in Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, California, and many, many other states also balked at the plans that cities and towns came up with regarding the return to the classroom and staged various forms of protest regarding the same. And parents were also fearful about returning their children to school as well. School districts formed various plans about how they would be or wouldn't be opening their schools. Everyone's comfort level was in flux. Some schools opened briefly, only to quickly close again, such as Boston Public Schools this past week, to the outrage of some families and the relief of others. Families are making plans about what is next for their children. Homeschooling, distance learning, online school with their district. As a response, some families formed education pods. This is a small cluster of homeschooling or distance learning families that have grouped together to hire a teacher or tutor and a curriculum by pooling their resources. So this keeps the exposure to a minimum for a group of kids and their families, as well as the educator too. So pods are very much like homeschooling co-ops of the past, before the pandemic. Now, I've realized through this pandemic that there's a lot of confusion over the difference between homeschooling and distance learning. So I thought it would be very valuable to discuss those differences here so that families can make an informed choice going forward and then be a strong and loud advocate when it's time to make their voice heard. As I was preparing my presentation, I wasn't sure this summer, preparing for this conference, what we were going to be looking at in the fall. But this looks like we're going to be in it for the long haul. So let's talk about the difference between homeschooling and distance learning and online school. Back when my children were little, homeschooling was still a bit more radical than it is today, given this current pandemic. Now, for those of you who don't know my story very well, I was raising those two daughters mostly alone after an early divorce. Elizabeth being profoundly disabled, and as I mentioned, blind and wheelchair bound with her intellectual disability. She was, again, a 29-week preemie and very medically fragile. but she was funny and sweet and loved butterflies. Then there was my youngest daughter, Caroline. Again, I don't talk about or write about Caroline too much because she just doesn't like it. She's 19 now and she is doing great. But for a while there, Caroline was a beautiful but intense child, as many special needs siblings can be. She was also very funny and artistic and loved to make movies and sing songs. But when Caroline was younger, she struggled enormously. She was always that kid in the corner playing with something else while all the other kids were listening at story time. Home life was busy and tragic. Caroline had a lot of different caregivers, lacked consistency, and seemed to go from one crisis to the next. And I just could not seem to slow the pace down. Many of you single moms, many of you moms, period, you're probably just nodding your heads right now with me because you know what I'm saying is truth. But then there was dance, and it was her thing, and she was pretty good at it. She wasn't the best in the group, and as usual, she awkwardly struggled to make friends, but she found her way to the middle of the pack, and I thought this would be okay. Elizabeth was getting more medically complex, just as we were getting more involved in this dance community. And Caroline was approaching her early tween years. So you can see this was all coming together. We were learning that some in the group were homeschoolers, and it sounded like a great idea to us at the time. So we dove into the deep end to learn more about it. Caroline was in a group of homeschoolers who were homeschooled because they were training in the arts or sports. This would include dance, actors, athletes like Olympians. Have you ever wondered how those 15-year-old gymnasts or skaters train all day? Or how those little kids can be in the musical School of Rock on Broadway? Homeschooling is how they do it. But actually, I was finding out there's a big difference in homeschooling, which has a lot to do with what is going on today during the pandemic. Homeschooling and distance learning are two very different things. Homeschooling involves the caregivers or parental lesson plans, and distance learning is still a school or teacher and tutor-led and approved curriculum that is facilitated on a distance learning platform. Our old correspondence style coursework of the past, in essence, now made more possible by computers and many different learning platforms. So hopefully that's making sense to you. There were not many homeschooling or distance learning programs to choose from back then. We opted for distance learning and used an approved curriculum that was actually affiliated with a public school in our state because that made it free. Most of the other programs came with hefty price tags, which we could not afford. And also, let's face it, I was way too busy with Elizabeth to actually be making up my own curriculum. That was not going to happen for me. Our choice was called K-12, and this is not an advertisement for their program. And although not too well known back then, I see them advertising all over the place now. So that gave Caroline access to an online classroom, a free computer, free books, and materials as if she were in a public school. Because after all, my tax dollars were paying for it anyway. And also a classroom teacher. So I didn't have to be the teacher. They even sent a microscope and little rocks for her to look at. It was very cool. Most importantly, I got to be her facilitator and I got to spend time with her. I got to see where her strengths were and where she was challenged. And my fondest memory was when we worked on a history project together about the Trail of Tears. We built a board game about the perils of the road west because she was a visual learner like me. Caroline was on her computer joining her class for about an hour or two each day around her dance schedule. The rest of the time was done on our own. The teacher would grade her work that we turned in. This is essentially what is happening today. That brings me to my next point about special needs. Caroline's learning challenges became clear to me during that time. I have heard from so many of you during this time of the pandemic as well that one of the best things to come out of all of this crisis is the closeness you have with your children. Being able to participate in those lessons with your children and their educators, you can see what they can do, what they cannot do. You can see how to present materials to your blind students, how to stretch your child for physical therapy, and how to break up a lesson plan for someone with executive function challenges. Maybe you are even recording these Zoom sessions to use later at your IEP meetings, you smart cookies, you. And some of you are finding that your children are not making progress at home, and that is okay too. It's all information that is useful and helps us know what will work in the future. No distance learning or homeschooling program for your son or daughter, or at least it must be designed very differently than what is being presented right now. Pods are probably not going to work for the most profoundly impaired children. They're probably not going to work for families with limited means, and they pose a real threat to pull talented teachers, therapists, and other ancillary educators away from school systems to private people who can pay on a much larger scale than before. Tragically, many educators and the general public look down on homeschooling due to cultural bias, stereotyping, misinformation, and a lack of understanding about concepts and outcomes. Just before the pandemic hit, Harvard Law School announced an event to discuss homeschooling, and I quote, "The focus will be on problems of educational deprivation and child maltreatment that too often occur under the guise of homeschooling." I myself had many discussions with friends and family alike, as well as my school system, about educating Caroline. There is a strong bias that homeschoolers are inferior, do not learn basic skills, and are indoctrinated with scary ideologies in the backwoods of America. I kid you not. These articles are out there, for example, by Harvard Law professor Elizabeth Bartholet, who quite literally equates homeschooling with child abuse. And you only need to read Tara Westover's best-selling memoir to be convinced of it. But what would they think now during the COVID pandemic when there are no good options? It's important to understand your rights as parents, which are complicated. All 50 states recognize the rights of parents to homeschool their children. And although there isn't exact constitutional right to homeschool, there are protections for parents under the First, 9th, and 10th Amendments of the Constitution. There are several Supreme Court, Court of Appeals cases that deal with this subject, recognizing parents' rights to educate their children at home. Here are a few things to consider as you are developing your plan. As the parent caregiver, do you have the ability, desire, and time to create your own curriculum? As the parent caregiver, do you require special training that you don't have yet to teach or care for your child? Has your child responded well to less social stimuli at home? Has your child regressed without their peers? Does your child have a low incidence disability such as blindness, deafness, etc.? Does your child require special equipment that you can only get at school, such as a vision room or standing frame? Does your child have a medical condition that will make it too risky to return to a classroom without a vaccine? What else do you need to consider? The bottom line is this: if you are not comfortable with how things are set up for your child in school, you have options. Your child is still entitled to a free and appropriate education under IDEA. That includes some circumstances, homeschooling and distance learning. But it also includes protections and accommodations under the ADA and numerous other state laws as well. So fast forward through Elizabeth's life, where I was in a position to make many decisions with her and for her. There were times when she was able to use her voice in many ways, but it was very easy to miss if you weren't listening. And then there were times when she couldn't assist me, and I had to speak for her by using my best tools to guide me as to what she would want for herself, not what I would want for her. The last time I had the honor of speaking for Elizabeth was when I had to make the very difficult decision to stop care and treatment and let her pass. It was a decision she unfortunately was not able to help me make. Some of you here today may know just what that feels like. During this pandemic, I've come to realize that we as human service workers, as advocates, as family members, and next friends, we stand in the breach for people with disabilities when they are unable to speak, advocate, and care for themselves. Under our current situation, your team is somewhat fractured, and more than ever, you are the hub and the gatekeeper of information. And as tired as you are, and with all the hats that you are wearing, it will be your job to lead this integration back to school and adult service programs successfully. So this is the time to pull out your best communication and leadership skills. Be thoughtful about the long-term value of developing relationships with physicians, providers, schools, caseworkers, and others, and nurture those relationships. Of course, you have legal rights, but remember, these rights are moderated by people. It's always better if plans are a team decision rather than a reluctant response to a demand. And give the team the benefit of the doubt and believe that everyone is working hard and trying their best. So even without a pandemic, educating children with special needs has been challenging, and IEPs are routinely violated across the country. Because the system is supposed to deliver an individualized approach, yet it is only built to deliver education in a systemic way, it tends to fail our children. I believe, as many others do, that this is a civil rights issue. Returning to school and returning to adult programming is going to require an individual assessment of risk versus benefit, which will clearly look different to every individual and every family, even if that individual child looks the same as the next one on paper. That's what makes this so hard and means that no one systemic approach will work. It costs a lot to educate our children in the system that we have, and we may want to think through how we rebuild our special education system to be responsive to the educational needs of children and families. And let's actually include family voices this time. Secretary DeVos this summer announced that if schools were not going to reopen, then she would hand out the money to families instead to educate their children. Well, why not? We could use it. Thank you. I will take your questions now.
Thank you, Annette. That was wonderful. I do have a comment, incredibly informative presentation. Thank you, Annette. I think we have time for one or two questions. The first came in and says, do you have suggestions for working with the school to create an IEP or other medical accommodations? What are the steps that can be taken if they are not being upheld or followed through with?
So my very first comment is always to stay calm and patient, and to try to develop a team approach and to bring in some key people to help you advocate. It is very difficult to do this alone. And if you've got, doctors, especially if you have a medically fragile child, which most of us are here because of medical fragile issues, having your doctor on your side can be most helpful, as well as, perhaps working within, some other social framework too. It can be pretty hard to go it alone when your school district is ignoring you. I wouldn't go legal right away. I always tell people, lawyering up right away is usually not the best place to go, because your school district just shuts down when the lawyer steps into the room. And so that's almost never the best way to go. The next thing is, remember that you are the expert, and always come from that place of power. You have all the answers. And if you come in with good solutions and you present those in a confident way, that will really come across too.
Great. And do we have time for one more question, Julie? Okay, there's one. It says, from your experience, are there ways to best support siblings of those with rare and complex diseases and/or special needs? And I know you know about this.
I love this topic. Sibling topics don't get talked about enough. at all. I talk about sibling topics in my book, and I lecture about it all the time. So it is so important to make sure that siblings have their own space. They have time with you as a parent, and they also get to develop themselves as an individual. Every person in the family, including parents, including siblings, really need to be able to develop as individuals. And I remember when Caroline shocked me at a very young age. And I realized at 6 years old, when she asked me when she was going to have to start changing Elizabeth's diapers, that she was worrying about, you know, when she was going to have to take over. And I knew that I had to create a safe space for her to be herself and not to have this identity only as a sister to this needy person in our family. And that's when dance came in, and she developed her own set of friends and her own identity. And whatever that thing is for your kid, or that those things are, you know, they need to have that. It has to be separate. And in my podcast, I also have sibling episodes, and it's just so important to keep talking about what siblings need. I hope that answers your question.
Great. We do have one more comment, but I think we might be almost out of time. It talks about do we think it's important to keep in mind that we are in the middle of a pandemic and you feel that the school is trying to do their best, but may not be able to uphold all of the rights?
Yes and no. Not at the expense of your child's needs. While I feel for the administrators and the teachers, that doesn't mean that your child should lose a year of education. I think if everybody puts their heads together, your child's needs can get met. There is no reason that kids should go without a year of education. Here's the problem that I see. Nobody's asking families. If people were not so interested in having dictating from the top down, which is what is happening right now, everybody's dictating what's going on from the top down, and nobody is actually including family voices in what is happening, except maybe in some very small communities. Families really are able to come up with some very brilliant solutions. And if anybody would just care to ask them, it would work out. And that is true of the disabled community everywhere. They will come up with their own solutions. They just, need to be asked.
Thank you so much, Annette. This was a really great topic. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing.
Well, thank you.
We're going to need to cut off now so that we have a little bit of a break, maybe like 5 minutes of a break. So I would encourage people to just feel around throughout the lobby, and please do go and visit the exhibitors. And of course, we do have the networking room that's open as well before we come on again at 10:30 and hear about legislative advocacy. So thank you again, Annette.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.